To my central argument, whether you're an agnostic or an atheist, the bottom line is that without the belief that there is a purpose to the universe, without a belief that there is a purpose to your life, without a belief that you have the capacity to make individual choices, it's very difficult to build a civilization. By difficult, I mean impossible.
All Mr. Shapiro is doing here is parading his philosophical ignorance. And it's absolutely absurd how anyone takes this guy seriously in matters of philosophy is beyond me.
If you ever try to bullshit me like that again, I will rip off your arms.
Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. Please consider becoming a patron today. Simply click the link in the description below. Thank you. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to another episode of the most annoying religious people. Up for today is political commentator Ben Shapiro, a theist who believes, at least according to the title of his very own video, that he has crushed an atheist's question. So following in Ben's footsteps and adopting his rhetorical style, if only for a moment, let's dive right in as I crush Ben Shapiro's alleged takedown of atheism. I hope you enjoy it.
I've noticed, in my opinion, I feel like you strawman a lot of atheist arguments. And I was wondering, can you give me your actual definition of atheism? Because I saw the conversation you had with Mr. Prager.
Yes.
And could you expand on that a little bit for me?
Sure. I mean, it would be more fun if you'd give me your definition of atheism, and then we could talk about it.
Yeah,
because,
absolutely. So I understand the dictionary definition of atheism is just somebody...
There is no God, yeah.
Right. But I think it's a little bit deeper than that. And out of the many atheists that I've talked to, I've never met a single one that says that they have empirical knowledge that God doesn't exist, and I feel like that's the argument that you're making. I could be wrong, I don't mean to misquote.
Well, to me, that was the difference definitionally between agnostics and atheists.
Right.
Right, so if you want to say that, if we want to talk about agnosticism and say maybe God exists, maybe doesn't, but I don't have evidence of it, so I don't believe, that's borderline agnostic atheist, that's fine. I mean, it doesn't really matter. I mean, to my central argument, whether you're an agnostic or an atheist, the bottom line is that without the belief that there is a purpose to the universe, without a belief that there is a purpose to your life, without a belief that you have the capacity to make individual choices, it's very difficult to build a civilization. By difficult, I mean impossible.
Okay. So on that note of free will, which is what you're talking about, right?
Yes. I think free will, by the way, is the single most important principle undergirding any civilization.
Okay, absolutely. And to be totally honest with you, I'm torn on the subject myself.
Yeah.
And which is why...
But in your own life, you're not, because you chose to come here and you chose to ask me a question, right?
It's complicated.
I would hate to think that the universe randomly imbued you with a set of atoms that showed up here randomly to ask me a question. That would be very disappointing to me.
And there you have it, folks. Mr. Ben Shapiro destroying an atheism question. So let's unpack this allegedly destructive argument and see if it holds up. Ben makes 3 key points which he ties together in a concern for building a successful civilization. I'll take them in order. First, Ben claims that without a belief that there's a purpose to the universe, it's very difficult to build a civilization.
The bottom line is that without the belief that there is a purpose to the universe, it's very difficult to build a civilization.
And by difficult, he clarifies that he means impossible.
And by difficult, I mean impossible.
I must say, in a video titled Ben Shapiro Crushes Atheism Question, this is a rather surprising point for Ben to make. For even if he's correct, it tells us nothing about the truth of the matter. I could grant Mr. Shapiro, for the sake of discussion, that believing there's no purpose to the universe makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to build a civilization. And yet, we'd be no closer to demonstrating a God exists. This kind of reasoning is fallacious, so much so that the fallacy has a name. That is, an appeal to consequences fallacy. This fallacy is committed when an individual concludes that an idea or proposition is true or false because the consequences of it being true or false are desirable or undesirable. The fallacy lies in the fact that desirability is not related to the truth value of ideas and or propositions. Ben appears to have completely missed the memo on this kind of fallacious reasoning. Hence, he's leading charge against atheism in this clip has something to do with civilizational collapse.
It's very difficult to build a civilization. By difficult, I mean impossible.
Again, and to be crystal clear, even if I granted that atheism leads to undesirable outcomes, the God hypothesis would be no likelier. And for any theist who's still not persuaded, just imagine a parody argument from the atheist perspective. Imagine I produced a video titled Magic Skeptic Crushes Theism Question. A video in which I attempted to debunk theism with the following claim. Believing in martyrdom and paradise makes it very difficult to avoid terrorism, and by difficult I mean impossible. Consider how irrelevant this claim is to the truth of the matter. Even if every believer in the history of theism that believed in both martyrdom and paradise carried out terrible acts of violence in the name of their faith, such an undesirable state of affairs would tell us nothing about the existence of God. Nor would it tell us anything about the truth of martyrdom or the existence of paradise. It's simply a non sequitur to suggest that a worldview is false because it produces undesirable consequences. To suggest otherwise is moronic beyond belief. I don't like the consequences associated with theism, therefore theism is false. I don't like the consequences associated with being diagnosed with a terminal illness, therefore the diagnosis is false. I don't like the consequences associated with my bank informing me that I'm bankrupt. Therefore, my bank manager's claim that I'm bankrupt is false. How absurd is this kind of reasoning? How fallacious is this kind of reasoning? And make no mistake, this is precisely what Ben Shapiro is doing here. Atheism leads to consequences I don't like. Therefore, atheism is false.
It's very difficult to build a civilization. By difficult, I mean impossible.
This is laughable. The undesirability of a consequence associated with a belief is irrelevant as to its truth value. Worse still, Shapiro is assuming that atheism entails a purposeless view of the universe. For why else would Mr. Shapiro's self-described central argument against atheism involve the enumeration of the consequences entailed by an absence of purpose?
To my central argument, whether you're an agnostic or an atheist, the bottom line is that without the belief that there is a purpose to the universe, without a belief that there is a purpose to your life, it's very difficult to build a civilization. By difficult, I mean impossible.
And I submit to you, dear listener, that this is simply not the case. Atheism is the view that no gods exist. Of course, theists believe that purpose is impossible in the absence of a god, hence Shapiro's assumption. But there are boatloads of alternative worldviews and perspectives which include purpose without recourse to gods. Shapiro and others may suggest that any purpose to be found in such a framework is vacuous because it rests upon a false and/or godless foundation. But such a response would simply beg the question. But I digress. At this point, Mr. Shapiro's point is abundantly clear. From his perspective, without purpose, i.e., without belief in God, it's impossible to build a civilization.
The bottom line is that without the belief that there is a purpose to the universe, it's very difficult to build a civilization. By difficult, I mean impossible.
By parity of reasoning, then, civilization entails purpose. Put another way, if A is necessary for B, then wherever we find B, A must be present as well. Some of you may push back and say that purpose is only necessary to build a civilization, not maintain it, but I doubt Shapiro would agree with you. By my lights, Shapiro is articulating a dependency relation, whereby civilization is contingent upon purpose, such that if purpose were removed, civilization would crumble.
It's very difficult to build a civilization. By difficult, I mean impossible.
With this in mind, we can use the structure of Shapiro's argument to work backwards, inferring purpose wherever we find civilization, this given the necessity of the relationship between the two. Look at the Scandinavian countries, the denizens of which are mostly atheists. Have not the Scandinavian countries built successful civilizations? I think it's abundantly clear that they have. Therefore, according to Mr. Shapiro's very own logic, the atheists of Scandinavia must have purpose as well.
Gotcha, bitch!
And the last thing I want to address on this point about purpose is this. Perhaps what Shapiro means when he implies that atheists believe there's no purpose in their lives is that atheists believe there's no objective purpose in their lives. In other words, Shapiro suspects that purpose on an atheist worldview is the functional equivalent of preferences. If I prefer the color blue and you prefer the color red, none of us are mistaken. There's no objectively correct color, just preferences. If my suspicion is correct, Shapiro believes that purpose would function the same way on an atheist worldview. Atheist A believes their purpose is to help those in need, whereas atheist B believes their purpose is to steal from those in need. There's no objective perspective from which to judge these respective purposes. It's all subjective. Leaving aside the appeal to consequences, which equally plagues this view, I would first like to point out that subjective purpose is still purpose. In other words, even if purpose is ultimately subjective, it wouldn't follow, therefore, that purpose does not exist. To suggest otherwise is moronic. Consider this analogy. Imagine an individual who believes that color is an objective domain, with right and wrong answers about the colors we ought and ought not use. Upon learning the error in their ways, would it be reasonable for them to dismiss color, claiming that it doesn't exist simply because it's not objective? I think not. There doesn't have to be an objectively best color for color and color preferences to exist. Just like there doesn't have to be an objectively best food in order for you to have your favorite dish. Just like there doesn't have to be an objectively best singer for you to have your favorite band, etc. Clearly, the subjectivity of a domain does not entail the non-existence of that domain. Hence, the same is true for purpose. So if this is the game that Shapiro is playing here, it's a pretty poor one. The subjectivity of purpose does not entail its non-existence. But even if it did, I fail to see how a God solves this problem. If God exists and he instructs us as to our purpose, it is little more than a naturalistic fallacy to suggest that such an instruction renders a binding normative commitment. In other words, it simply doesn't follow from God having declared my purpose that I ought do anything, let alone live according to it. Put another way, it simply doesn't follow from God having declared my purpose that purpose is an objective domain. In short, it's just another case of a theist pretending that their worldview is superior. Not to mention the blindingly obvious fact that grounding purpose in God's mind renders it definitionally subjective anyway. For subjectivity is to do with minds. If something is objective, this would mean it was mind independent. But you're rooting purpose in the mind of God. Henceforth, it's not objective. It is subjective. It is in the mind of God. So even if God does exist, and even if purpose is grounded in his divine mind, we'd be no closer to demonstrating the existence of objectively existing or factually existing purpose on a theistic worldview. Suffice to say, the idea that atheism entails no purpose, and by extension, civilizational collapse, is not only false, but even if it were true, these unpleasant consequences would tell us nothing at all about the likelihood that atheism is false. So Shapiro's argument fails for three key reasons. 1, it's an appeal to consequences, which makes it fallacious from the word go. 2, it rests on the assumption that atheists cannot have purpose, something which I've challenged with counterexamples. And 3, theism doesn't offer an objective basis for purpose anyway.
Oh, I get it!
The final topic that Mr. Shapiro raises in relation to producing a successful civilization is that of free will.
I think free will, by the way, is the single most important principle undergirding any civilization.
Please notice that this has nothing to do with atheism. Once again, Shapiro assumes that atheism entails something that it doesn't. In this case, determinism. The problem is, you'll meet many atheists who are either libertarians or compatibilists. And this is because there's nothing intrinsically deterministic about atheism. But perhaps Mr. Shapiro is making the mistake here of assuming that atheism and physicalism are somehow equivalent. This is a very common mistake on the religious right, and it must be challenged wherever and whenever we encounter it. The truth is, atheism doesn't entail physicalism. You can be an atheist and believe in any kind of metaphysics you want. The only thing that atheism rules out is belief in gods.
No shit.
But the assumption that all atheists are physicalists is not the only mistake that may be operating beneath the surface here. There's also a secondary assumption, the assumption that physicalists cannot ground free will, or that they cannot offer an account for free will.
The plausibility of the compatibilist view that I hold, I don't take to be self-evident. I believe it takes philosophical argumentation for it. I completely agree that those drawn to incompatibilism, those drawn to the view that you can't have both deterministic physical laws and robust free will think if naturalism is true and the best science teaches us that determinism is true, itself a controversial question whether that's the best interpretation of our best science, then we'll lack free will. And then if free will is necessary for having special value, then we'll lack special value. But there's a lot of premises before we get to the conclusion that naturalism doesn't have space for this special value. And I reject several of those premises, which is why I'm not feeling uncomfortable by the challenge that Bill's raising.
Dan, if I were to believe in materialism, physicalism, that everything in my mind is my brain and everything is determined in a physical world, how then can I have free will?
Free will is just as hard to reconcile with indeterminism. If the world is undetermined, it's just as hard to see how you could have free will that mattered because you want to determine what you do. If we want to get clear on this, we have to see what inevitable means. It means unavoidable. So then we have to get clear about what avoiding is. And then we can begin to see the biological dimension. Because what's happened on this planet over the last 4 billion years has been an explosion of avoiding. What evolution has done is designed organisms that do a little bit of avoiding. And there's been an arms race. And the avoiders have become cleverer and cleverer and cleverer. And how do you avoid something? You avoid something by anticipating it and then taking corrective measures.
Right.
What we have to understand is that free will is our capacity to see probable futures that seem like they're gonna happen in time to take steps so that something else happens instead. The varieties of free will worth wanting, as I've said, are perfectly compatible with determinism.
You may or may not find their view very persuasive, but that's beside the point. The truth is, there are physicalists who have offered an account of free will on a purely physicalist worldview. Worse still, Shapiro is implying that free will is only possible on a theistic worldview, but such an assumption is demonstrably incorrect. Dualists, for example, locate the libertarian will in an immaterial consciousness or soul. This immaterial substrate, being a non-physical substance, is not subject to the deterministic forces of physics which act on physical objects. You may be quick to interject by pointing out that atheists don't believe in immaterial substrates or souls, but you'd be mistaken. Sure, it might not be common in the atheist community, but some atheists do believe in these things. And nothing about such a belief is contrary to atheism. Consider philosopher David Chalmers.
I am myself an atheist. I don't believe in God, so God doesn't have a central role in my philosophy. That said, I don't rule out the possibility that, for example, our universe was created. I've entertained the possibility that we live in a simulation. That said, I think there's, picture of consciousness which I'm interested in is one that is also independently attractive to people who come from religious backgrounds, who have their own independent reasons, for example, for embracing a dualist worldview. So I found much in common and much of interest to talk about in discussions with people who've been exploring these quite similar ideas, maybe for quite different religious reasons. So I think there's a lot of room for dialogue there.
And there you have it, an atheist who believes in the immaterial. One can be an atheist who believes in souls, ghosts, spirits, reincarnation, etc. Suffice to say, theism is not a necessary precondition for libertarian free will, because, theoretically speaking, it is trivially easy to avoid physical determinism by positing an immaterial substrate in which libertarian free will can reside. But Ben Shapiro appears to be completely ignorant of all of this. He's completely ignorant about the rich history of dualism. He's completely ignorant about the varieties of atheism that exist. From his perspective, atheism is physicalism, and physicalism can't have free will, therefore atheism is false. As I hope I've demonstrated in this video thus far, this chain of reasoning is completely absurd. It is flawed on multiple levels, and it is fallacious in the extreme. All this serves to demonstrate is Mr. Shapiro's ignorance on philosophical matters. But the problems don't stop there. According to Mr. Shapiro, the questioner has tacitly acknowledged their own free will by virtue of having attended the event and having stood up to ask a question.
Okay, absolutely. And to be totally honest with you, I'm torn on the subject myself.
Yeah.
And which is why.
But in your own life, you're not, because you chose to come here and you chose to ask me a question, right?
It's complicated.
This is a completely moronic take. Does Shapiro believe that an agent's capacity to act entails free will? Were that the case, Shapiro would be forced to concede that a robot vacuum has free will. After all, such a vacuum has a capacity to act, does it not? You may respond by pointing out that the vacuum's actions aren't freely chosen, whereas human actions are, but such a rejoinder would simply beg the question. How, you might ask? Well, let's have a brief recap, shall we? 1. Shapiro implies that a capacity to act entails free will.
But in your own life, you're not, because you chose to come here and you chose to ask me a question.
2. I point out that robot vacuums have a capacity to act. Were that the case, Shapiro will be forced to concede that a robot vacuum has free will. 3. You say vacuums don't act freely. Conclusion. Therefore, a human's capacity to act serves as evidence for free will because a human's capacity to act is freely chosen. So the evidence that I can freely act is that I freely act. Get out of here with that garbage. What utter nonsense. This is manifestly circular, and as such, no reasonable person should take it seriously. So no, I'm sorry, Mr. Shapiro, but the questioner's attendance and their subsequent question do not entail a belief in free will. Such things can be cashed out in purely deterministic terms. The agent attends your event because they have a desire to. This desire is caused by having watched your videos on the internet, which entertained them. They encountered your videos because they were scrolling through social media. They were scrolling through social media because they were bored, etc., etc., etc. I can keep tracing the deterministic chain of causation for their attendance and the question they posed, but I won't bore you, because the point should be clear by now. Nothing about this encounter entails or assumes the existence of libertarian free will, and to suggest otherwise is to demonstrate one's ignorance on the subject. Not to mention the ignorance that's demonstrated by the assumption that this debate about free will has literally anything to do with atheism. There are atheists on both sides of this issue. You could be an atheist and be a libertarian. You could be an atheist and be a compatibilist. You could be an atheist and be a determinist. Case in point, two of the world's most recognizable atheists, those being Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett, got embroiled in a debate on this very topic. Sam Harris is a determinist and Daniel Dennett is a compatibilist. And this despite the fact that both men are self-described atheists. Yet, Shapiro's commentary on this topic would have us believe that atheists come off of an assembly line with identical philosophical viewpoints. But the blindingly obvious reality is, nothing about atheism entails one view or the other. But here we have Mr. Shapiro, an allegedly intelligent philosophical commentator, assuming that atheism entails determinism. It is utter garbage.
To my central argument, whether you're an agnostic or an atheist, the bottom line is, without a belief that you have the capacity to make individual choices, it's very difficult to build a civilization. By difficult, I mean impossible.
So all Mr. Shapiro is doing here is parading his philosophical ignorance. And it's absolutely absurd how anyone takes this guy seriously in matters of philosophy is beyond me. In closing, Shapiro says,
I would hate to think that the universe randomly imbued you with a set of atoms that showed up here randomly to ask me a question. That would be very disappointing to me.
While this is clearly a tongue-in-cheek comment, expressed no doubt for the purposes of levity, at the same time I feel it's symptomatic of the entire exchange. Shapiro tells us that he would hate to think that this is all random. The thing is, if you cast your mind back to his other comments in this exchange, you'll notice that this is something of a theme. Shapiro's entire soliloquy is rooted in emotion. The appeal to consequences which undergirds his thinking pervades his every thought. In fact, one could summarize Shapiro's entire statement as follows: I wouldn't like it if atheism were true. And this coming from a man who built his career on the adage, facts don't care about your feelings.